So I finally saw Spider-Man Far From Home, and yeah, I liked it. I thought it was a good Marvel film, similar in quality to say Ant-Man, but it wasn't a fantastic film. So FYI, there will be spoilers for Spider-Man Far From Home this video, so that's me warning you, so let's just jump in. Far From Home picked up for me in quality once Mysterio was obviously revealed to be the villain. For comic book readers, this was an obvious twist, but was handled quite well in the film, and I think was a good twist for general audience members. But in this video, I don't want to do a review, as there are plenty of reviews out there. Instead, I want to talk about the MCU's Spider-Man villain / Tony Stark problem. Spider-Man villains in film have notoriously followed a similar structure. They are somehow linked to Peter's life, an experiment goes wrong, and they become a villain. Job done. Mysterio is the first villain I can think of which hasn't followed this pattern. However, a new structure for a villain, Spider-Man, is forming, and whilst it fits for the MCU, I think it's lazy writing. What I'm talking about is all the MCU Spider-Man villains we have had all been wronged by Tony Stark, and have rightly been angry. Michael Keaton's Vulture essentially went into bankruptcy when Tony Stark overtook the project to clean up the city after the New York battle, and in order for Adrian Toomes to put food on the table, decided to resort to crime selling Chitauri weapons. And Jake Gyllenhaal's Mysterio had his life work claimed by Tony Stark and, in his eyes, misused. Tony subsequently fired him, so both characters have very obvious grievances, and whilst yes, perhaps resorting to crime is a bit drastic, you understand why they have done it. The problem I have with this aspect of creating Spider-Man villains is that our main character Peter Parker idolises Tony Stark. All Peter Parker wants to do, be like him. However, he has met two villains now who have had very obvious grievances with Tony Stark and were obviously wronged by him in a bad way. However, despite seeing their pain and what has become of them due to Tony Stark's actions, Peter never questions or has doubts over what a great man Tony Stark was. His feelings never change, and he continues to idolise him. Peter never goes on a search for answers, and perhaps realised that Tony was not all he was cracked up to be, and actually did some very shady things. I would even be fine with Peter speaking with Happy Hogan, questioning Tony's morals, and perhaps we realise the story we're being given by the villains is not the whole story, and there are obviously two sides to this, but this never happens. The story that Mysterio tells about Tony Stark mistreating him is evidently the backstory the writers are going with, and are telling the audience this is how the series events unfolded, and Tony's selfish actions are to blame for the creation of these villains Spider-Man must now face. There was no misdirection or other side of the story being presented. The MCU is tiptoeing itself around the subject that Tony Stark was actually not all that great a guy, and are trying to paint him as the best bloke ever. I would find it far more interesting if some of the bad things Tony did were actually referenced by the wide character of the MCU, and especially with his protege, Peter Parker. A major problem for me is the MCU is not allowing Peter to become his own person and make his own choices. So much of what he does is based around Tony Stark and what he wanted for him, and Peter's idolisation of him, I think for the character's beginnings, was a good way to go and set the character up nicely. However, Peter is not building his own path or learning from some of the mistakes Tony made. Peter sees him as the perfect person who did little wrong. However, I feel Peter, for his own growth, needs to be able to reference the fact that Tony has done some very bad things, and perhaps he is not the perfect person he perceives him to be. It will aid Peter's development and enable him to make decisions for himself and decide the person that he wants to be instead of the person Tony wants him to be. There is nothing wrong with him looking up to Tony, but at the same time not wanting to be him. I would have been more interested in the Mysterio Peter Parker hero villain dynamic if Peter did start to ask questions of Tony, and instead of Peter being totally against Mysterio, actually sympathised for what had happened to him and tried to get him to stop what he was doing. By the end, Peter could have heated discussions with Happy Hogan regarding Tony's ethics, and perhaps he was not the man he thought him to be, which would give Happy's line to Peter that he wanted him to be better than Tony more weight, as Peter decides the man he wants to be and doesn't need to be the next Iron Man or take the reins from Tony Stark. He can be his own person, and let's not forget he is Spider-Man. The problems I am finding with the Tony Stark and Peter Parker dynamic is there is no friction. Peter really should be asking questions of Tony. Tony has been a reckless character. A key example is the fact Tony dragged a 15-year-old Peter Parker to Berlin to fight Captain America. Now, at the time, I understand why Peter was excited to go with Tony and join up with the Avengers, but as Peter becomes older and wiser about the situations around him, he should realise how actually Tony didn't always have his best interests at heart, and in some cases was more concerned about his ego. The fact is, I just want to see Spider-Man become his own character. Perhaps this will happen over time in future films, but currently I feel like Peter Parker is being groomed to be a new version of Tony Stark. when Peter needs to be his own character in his own right. Don't forget, Spider-Man is the biggest superhero in the world, so shouldn't be essentially a backing player to the MCU, and should be front and center, which I think is the future plan of Spider-Man in the MCU, but I do want to see him step out of Tony's shadow. The charm of Peter Parker comes from how relatable the character is. He has similar problems to everyday people involving relationships, work and money. Some of that charm is being stripped away from the character as he becomes less relatable, as he is so close to Tony Stark, who is leaving behind these incredible gadgets. And I ask myself the question, why would Peter Parker have everyday problems when he has the backing of a billionaire and his company? Whilst they are giving Peter real life problems, these are fairly minor, such as things as having his first kiss or too busy being Spider-Man that he can't go on a date. When Peter gets older and, for example, works for the Daily Bugle, this would be confusing for me, as I would wonder, why does Peter Parker even need this job at the Bugle when he could literally live at the Avengers compound and get by just being a superhero? Now Peter is being pulled away from such normal life, it's hard to give him real world problems which are relatable for general audience members, because this is a kid backed by a billionaire. It sounds like I didn't enjoy Far From Home in this video, which is not the case. It's not the best Spider-Man film ever made, or the best MCU film ever, but it's definitely a solid entry into the MCU, and I was happy to see it picked up some of the pieces left by Endgame, but wasn't too heavily focused on that film, and was able to move the MCU forward. And I am looking forward to see where they go with the character, especially after Peter's identity was revealed in the mid-credits by Mysterio, and how the Skrulls will play further into the MCU. But I truly hope the Tony Stark and Peter Parker dynamic is resolved and some actual friction is added between the characters, and Peter starts to step up as his own character and realise he doesn't need to come out of Tony's shadow, and he can just be his own character and his own man. Don't forget, Peter Parker is a genius and shouldn't be leaning so heavily on Tony Stark for everything. He was able to design his web shooters, and I would like him to be able to design his own suits, but everything comes from Tony Stark, and I feel the character hasn't been able to learn and grow because everything has been handed to him currently. But we will see in further films, perhaps Peter will start to realise he needs to stop idolising Tony Stark so much and decide the man he wants to be. That's it for this video, and as always, thank you for watching.